We are now undergoing the beginnings of a once in a 500-year epochal shift.
I think if liberal democracy can't guarantee across generations, then I don't see how it can survive.
Free university, an independent judiciary, a free press. Surely doesn't that validate liberal democracy?
Problem here is that we also have stringent speech laws that were applied where they shouldn't have. I mean, on
but
raw
we can
numbers,
be in jail for being
on raw
here
numbers, more people.
if we
Hang
were
on,
in Russia.
hang on,
even the audience.
hang on. On raw numbers, more people are jailed for speech violations in the UK than they are in Russia.
Wait, we've got to get into this. Which numbers are you using?
Hello and a very warm welcome back to Season 2 of Ctrl Alt Deceit, Democracy in Danger. I'm Nina Dos Santos, your host. We have 8 new episodes coming up as part of this second series, and our first one was recorded before a live audience at London's Frontline Club. This edition was taped on April the 3rd. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Ctrl Alt Deceit, a podcast which is designed, as you just heard there, to dive into the threats that our democratic institutions are facing these days and to ask the basic question, just how much danger are they in? I'm Nina Dos Santos, former CNN anchorwoman and also an international broadcaster.
And I'm Owen Bennett-Jones, a writer and university teacher and formerly a BBC foreign correspondent.
Well, the re-election of President Trump, of course, has thrown something of a hand grenade, I think it's fair to say, into the international rules-based order, not to mention the world economic system in the last 24 hours or so. And that's one of the reasons why Owen and I began this podcast on the eve of the US election back in November 2024. Its premise then remains the same as it is today. Perhaps arguably it's even more important. What we're trying to do here is, as you can hear in the name, figure out who is controlling the narrative these days, have a look at which alternative facts they're using to do that, and further down the line to try and understand where all this deception will lead.
And on this week's episode, which is the first of our second series, we're asking, is this the end of liberal democracy? Gabriel rather worryingly asked me, he's told me he's going to ask me to define liberal democracy.
We should know what we're talking about.
So he's got me thinking already. But that's what we're going to try. Our title is this the end of liberal democracy?
That's right. And just a quick forward to this, obviously since 1945, as many of us in this room probably know full well, countries that aligned themselves with America's interests and accepted its influence benefited enormously in terms of peace, prosperity, and up until recently they appeared to share a common sense of purpose. But a lot of that has changed. That brings us to the main question we're trying to answer here, and that is what to do when the biggest champion of Western values appears to be against the West.
And so that raises, we're in an interesting moment. And it used to be that the main challenges to the idea of democracy came from the communist bloc, from Islamist movements. Now it seems to be coming from within, and perhaps the States is leading it, and we have the Bannonites, if we can call them that, Steve Bannon, who believes in capital T traditionalism, some sort of ancient spirituality that he is looking back to and hoping to revive. There are the tech magnates like Peter Thiel, perhaps sovereign individuals who believe that they can break through all the tax systems and have an elite of people who are highly capable running things. So there are these ideas now coming from within the West, challenging what we have all assumed were settled issues for many years.
Yeah, we're recording this particular episode live from the Frontline Club, which is a venerable institution run by journalists, dedicated to the work of journalists, and us two journalists are in the company of other journalists. So let me introduce you to them. Without further ado, Gabriel Gatehouse, give us a rough, rendu compte of your recent work.
So I was a BBC foreign correspondent for, almost 2 decades, really. My background's in Russian. I started off in the BBC's Russian service and then moved on. Eventually I was Newsnight's chief foreign correspondent, as a result of which I kind of saw many of the big events that have shaped our world from a sort of front seat perspective. I left the BBC in 2022 to go independent. I'm still doing stuff for the BBC, but also for others, Channel 4 and other people. And I did a big podcast series and wrote a book called The Coming Storm, which was basically a kind of deep historical dive into some of the conspiracy theories that surrounded January the 6th, 2021 and the storming of the Capitol and where they came from.
Thank you, Gabriel. And we also have Connor Tomlinson, and perhaps I can ask you to give us a quick tour as well.
Yes, I've only ever been described as a journalist once by Byline Times in an attempt to insult me, so I won't try and claim your mantle. I am a columnist over at Courage Media, which is run by the very venerable Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I'm probably one of the most acidic ones over there. I co-hosted a show on the New Culture Forum called Deprogrammed. I have just left UK media startup called lotuseaters.com, where I hosted my own show there. It's a little bit of a Daily Wire style thing. I co-founded the British Conservation Alliance back in 2019, which was a market-based environmental think tank to try and tell the government that they were spending money in the wrong places on the attempt to combat climate change. And the reason I got more into commentary on this sphere of things is because I had a few chats with Conservative ministers at the time, and I realised, absolutely nobody's listening, and they're just more interested in preserving their own job security than they are in enacting the will of the people and delivering good money for public funds. So yeah, that's why I'm sitting here, and I'm probably going to take some unpopular stances that you can yell at me for.
No, it'll be yelling, I'm sure. So I think what we'll do at the beginning of this is just try and understand where everyone's coming from. So Gabriel, why don't you kick us off with your take on the basic question we got this evening? Is this the end of liberal democracy?
I sort of, I like to put myself in the position of the 15th century European peasant, wringing his hands over the end of the feudal order. Oh my God, all these certainties that we've been living under for centuries, they're being washed away by the printing press and the gunpowder revolution and all this other stuff. My God, what should we do? This is terrible. And of course it was terrible. I mean, there was a lot of bumpiness along the way. But then it led to the Enlightenment and liberal democracy and other things, which was the sort of the modern era, the birth of modern capitalism. I was born in 1977. I think I was probably born into the tail end of that era. I feel like we are now undergoing the beginnings of a once in a kind of 500-year epochal shift, although the timeline seems to be speeding up. And it's driven, I think, by tech and economics. Naomi Alderman, the novelist, writer and video game developer, is very interesting on this. She calls this the third information crisis. So the first was the invention of writing, which coincided with the shift from nomadic to agricultural societies. The second was the invention of the printing press, which again coincided with the end of the feudal order and the beginning of the modern world. And the third is computer technology and the internet, and this third information crisis that we're just at the beginning of now. We don't know where it's going to end, but we do know that it's going to change. And so I find that my job, I've spent a lot of time listening to people who are in the grip of various miasmas of conspiracy theories and delusions. And then there's a lot of people who are just kind of putting out blatant falsehoods out there in a very cynical way. And I think the response from the sort of centre, the establishment, has been to try and batten down the hatches and go, stop it, everybody. Everything is all right. Can you just, please? And I don't think that is the right response because A, everything is not all right. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having all this turbulence. And B, things are going to change. So you'd better focus your energies on thinking about how you would like them to change rather than maintaining the status quo.
So it sounds as though it's very clear that you believe that liberal democracy as we know it is under threat, particularly for future generations, because I'm a little bit younger than you, but again, from that sort of generation where we remember the benefits of this type of economic and societal prescription.
I mean, we can still see those benefits, right? They're not. It's not all
we
bad.
We can, but they're
right?
not always there for people entering the workforce now. And I'm sure that Connor, in a moment, you're going to give us your point of view as somebody who I think is younger than many of us on this panel, and you also describe yourself as a revolutionary Zoomer. So I'd love to hear about how technology is changing how you think about this. How do you think liberal democracy can survive? I mean, is it just basically over as we know it?
I think we should define it, right? Should we get straight into defining it? Because how are we defining liberal democracy? Maybe you dreamt up this title. So
I will offer you the thought that it is the defence of free press, independent universities, independent judiciary, all the institutions that we think have guaranteed and created peace and prosperity for the last 80 years and have delivered fantastic benefits to people in the West, that those are the things that are now under threat and are worth defending.
But does it include liberal economics?
I mean, to me, that's not the centre of it, but why don't you...
Well, my view on it is that you can't really separate the economics out of it. Liberal economics, this globalization, which kind of essentially began in the 1970s, but after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, liberalism in all of its forms had basically won. As it was kind of evinced by Bill Clinton, who was bestrode such a wide swathe of the political centre ground that essentially, if you were to be in opposition to the Clinton juggernaut, by definition you had to be an extremist. You either had to be on the far right or the far left, and economics was a big part of that. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of people have become disillusioned with the liberal world order is because the economic system provided actually for very little avenue for opposition. You could, in America, let's say, amongst Republicans and Democrats, you could vote for two different flavors of the same ice cream, essentially. And I think that is one of the reasons why a lot of people feel that democracy isn't working.
Just going back to that point about economics, you mentioned Bill Clinton. He famously said, didn't he, something like he wanted to come back as the bond market, famous quotes ascribed to his speechwriters were, "It's the economy, stupid." None of that has changed. I mean, you look at what Liz Truss tried to do with her budget in her 40-odd days in office, and she was constrained by this type of economics that you're talking about,
Correct.
right?
So I think that is a really good example of where, I mean, we had a prime minister who was not elected by a popular plebiscite, but she was nevertheless there as a result of a democratic system working in the way that it was designed to do. Whether or not you agreed with how it came about, she came there as part of our democratic system. She tried to radically reform the economic system. She came with a political program. She tried to reform, and computer says no. It's like, you can't do that. so you're out, right? I think one of the kind of critiques of this illusion of choice in the political system that we have is that you do have a significant choice. And I think one of the things that people are chafing against is that whether you come at it from the right or you come at it from the left, if you're too far out of those bounds, it's just not an option.
Thank you, Gabriel. Let's ask Connor to basically lay out his basic position. I mean, as you said when I talked to you before, an opening statement, as it were. What's your opening statement?
I think Gabriel and Nina both provide a really good launch pad for this. So I've got a couple of stats to hand, because you said that there might be a bit of a generational divide here. So recently there was a Channel 4 poll that came out, I think it was in February of this year. 52% of my generation, I'm Gen Z, on the upper end of Gen Z, hence the grey patch and the beard. I'm 26, but anyone born between 1997 with the election of Blair and 2012 with about the advent of the smartphone. 52% said they would prefer a strongman leader who could ignore Parliament and elections to run the country. This follows an Onward survey in 2022 where 61% of 18 to 34s, so creeping up a little bit, said the same thing. 75% said they would prefer to have experts in charge, kind of parlance from the COVID era, and 46% said they like a military dictatorship. So, again, quite interesting. There you go. Also, that's combined at the same time with only 11% of my generation say they would enlist to fight to defend said democracy. And I think, what was it? Up in the 40s%, 41% said under no circumstances would they fight to defend Britain. And I think this is of liberal democracy's own making. And there's a couple of points here. The first is that, yes, it's a victim of its own success in terms of economics. Because well, quite. But let's say Francis Fukuyama declared end of history, we're victorious at the end of the Cold War, the science is settled, this is the only model for governance, and hey presto, we just need to roll it out across every country in the world and we'll have John Lennon's Imagine. But relatively to other countries, the West is economically prosperous, especially in the 90s. We've stagnated since 2008, particularly in GDP per capita. That might have something to do with why my generation feel democracy isn't delivering for them and they want something else. But that has attracted a large number of people, unprecedented number of people, to move from corners of the world where democracy is less self-evident to them, to our parts of the world. And I think it's interesting that because we think of liberal democracy as an end-of-history ideology, the goods of it are so self-evident, that we think as soon as people arrive here, they're going to agree with us instantly. The economic opportunities provided are going to be ineluctably powerful to them. Well, I don't think this is the case for my generation. I can only speak from lived experience, which we put a lot of premium on these days. But as we've become more demographically diverse, we've become more culturally diverse, the traditions of Western liberal democracy are not so self-evidently good to young people. And so you're getting a fracturing along political and cultural lines.
But I mean, it seems to me from what you've just said there, the people who most value liberal democracy and will risk their life to get here, to live in it, are those who don't have it. And that makes sense to me. I mean, if I was living in a developing country where I didn't have some of those things I mentioned earlier, a free university, an independent judiciary, a free press, and all the rest of it, I think I'd want to move too. So surely doesn't that validate liberal democracy?
No, and I'll give you some examples from the Henry Jackson Society here. 75% of second-generation British-born Muslims, 18 to 30, mainly young men, mainly university educated, think Hamas did nothing wrong on October 7th. So this is not transferring across generations, and migration is not necessarily done for values-based reasons. It might be done for economic opportunities, because as we've said, we're a very abundant country compared to lots of nations that don't have liberal democracies, but it doesn't necessitate that the people coming for the economic opportunities are going to uphold those ideals. And this is one final thing that I'd like to get into. I agree with Gabriel. We've defined liberal democracy, but nowhere in your definition was the people actually voting. It was all of the institutions that are set up around the voting process that can shepherd what is the acceptable, proper boundaries of voting discourse. As Gabriel said, like Bill Clinton occupies such a centre ground that anything except Bill Clinton, or Tony Blair as counterpart, is far right or far left. And that's set by these supposedly neutral institutions, a free press, a judiciary, a university system. Well, clearly they're not necessarily independent because they're involved in upholding a certain value set that then upholds a certain political order, which allows certain politicians to take up the large share of that value set. And when someone, like Liz Truss, good example, tries to break from that consensus, well, the institutions react badly and she's gone. So is it actually democratic if the institutions have more say over necessarily the voting public?
I mean, I thought that was a difficult argument to run now when we've got a new insurgent party that is breaking through. I mean, surely the institutions that I mentioned, I mean, I certainly did not deliberately leave out the electoral process, which obviously is central to liberal democracy. But if you've got an insurgent party breaking through...
We're saying Reform UK, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then
Nigel Farage is feeling a large amount of pressure from within his party and within the Westminster bubble, mainly controlled, sort of the Overton window being controlled by the media that he is answerable to soften his message. And this is actually causing a lot of consternation from Reform's core voters, which is causing defections on the local level.
Because most of the electorate's in the middle. I mean, it happens to every party.
That's inaccurate, though. We've just done a series of polling, just quickly on that said that, so Nigel Farage has said, we won't deport illegal immigrants. We're not going to do it. Like, he's ruled that out. He said that's impossible. Recent polling has showed that even a majority of Green Party voters, 53%, thinks we should deport foreign criminals. So actually Reform are now to the left as a majority of Green Party voters because they
just
feel...
point out you're mixing things up there. You're mixing illegal immigrants and foreign criminals up there.
Okay,
just to point out...
Fair point. Let's say to at least the left of his own voters then, because that was 91% of Reform voters said that we should
got to be careful with statistics.
Yeah, quite. No, agreed. Understand.
So let's internationalise this a bit, because these are the sort of arguments. We're not just talking about the UK, and obviously Reform will get the pulse of how much support Reform really has in a month or so's time when we've got the local elections, right? But if we internationalise it, broadly speaking, there is a disaffectation with the fruits of Western-style liberal democracy. It's interesting, Connor, that you raised the subject of Israel, because there are some people inside Israel who may say that there is a democratic deficit there as well. So Western-style liberal democracy, broadly speaking, do you think the death knell has been rung for it? What is going to come thereafter? You obviously have quite a sort of set point of view, it seems.
I think if liberal democracy can't guarantee across generations its own culture, and therefore the people most likely to defend it when it's under attack by threats by the likes of China, then I don't see how it can survive. And I think the liberalism in democracy makes it refrain from picking a particular conception of the good that is local to that country rather than upholding a rules-based international order. But all of those loyalties to family, to place, to faith, to community, to culture are the kinds of things that, you know, like young men like me would enlist to defend, to take up arms to defend. And if the state has eroded that over time, then it has weakened its own ability to charge people with its defence.
Okay, let's turn to Gabriel. I think, I don't know if we want to look at the US a bit, where you spent a lot of your time and doing a lot of reporting on Jan 6th and, you know, the threats to democracy that was wrapped up in that. First of all, do you think the US is ahead of Europe in terms of these trends?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially if you're talking about, I mean, what I spent a lot of time looking at in The Coming Storm was, for want of a better word, a sort of a sudden and catastrophic loss of a shared factual frame of reference, I think, which is what is happening. You know, the two halves of America, you know, all the platitudes about America being divided and blah, 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 that has now it's become a place where somebody described it to me as there's two movies, all with the same characters, but with completely different plot lines. So there are two movies playing in America, and people are in entirely separate movie theatres watching the same characters play out. They have no shared factual frame of reference, and I don't think it's sustainable to run a successful democracy which relies on an engaged and informed populace that agrees on the same set of facts to run a democracy where that is no longer the case.
I mean, about a year ago, there was a lot of talk of, is there going to be a civil war in America? I mean, you hear it less now, I don't quite know why, but that was much discussed not long ago. Do you think there is going to be some sort of violent conflict?
And do you hear it less because Donald Trump did actually win the election?
Well, I mean, I did think that, and I spent quite a lot of time making myself unpopular with a lot of people by saying that I thought democracy's best chance of survival, slim though it was, in America, was an emphatic Trump win. And then when that happened, everyone was quite angry with me. But I didn't do it, guys.
I'm sure Canada was very angry this year.
It wasn't me. But I did think that the most likely scenario towards civil conflict in America was if Trump lost narrowly and his supporters for the second time running, or he didn't accept the loss, laid out the cheating kind of mantra for the second time running. And then, you know, when people don't believe they can change their leaders at the ballot box, they obviously look for other means to do so. And, you know, those people happen to be the ones with the most guns. So that was my, my sort of thinking on that. I don't think the threat of civil conflict in America has gone away. And I don't think that, you know, it's Trump supporters who have a monopoly on violence. You know, there was only one serious assassination attempt in the last presidential election, and it was against Donald Trump. And another one was foiled before it. But you know, so I don't think we're past that danger point. And yes, I'm afraid my glass is very much half empty on America.
Why is that? I mean, obviously, I've spoken to a lot of Americans who say, look, there's no way he can change the Constitution enough to stay in power, you know, past the Rubicon of trying to stay in power for a third term. But do you think that that's possible, given many of the conspiracy theorists you've been speaking to who actually took part in the Jan 6 insurrection when obviously he didn't want to hand over power? I mean, could we see it again? And would that be the end of democracy as we know it in places like this that obviously march to the drumbeat that America sets on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the threats to American democracy sort of don't really center around whether Trump moves things around so that he can run for a third term. I mean, FDR did 3 terms. Yes, it's like, it wasn't the end of democracy. It was arguably the beginning of it, if you're taking liberal democracy as your definition. So I don't see that really as a threat. I think some of the things that you talked about in your introduction, which is the erosion of the rule of law, the politicization, the weaponization of the legal system, is probably a more serious threat, I think, to democracy. And I think that,
again, I don't want to sort of be in the position of both sides in everything, because that gets
annoying.
After all, you're BBC.
But you can take a man out of the BBC, but you can't take the BBC out of the man. I would say that, that there was an awful lot of lawyering going on during the first Trump administration to try to sort of prove that the guy was a Kremlin agent and therefore was an agent of a hostile foreign power, which really was very poorly evidenced. In a way, that gave the MAGA people the kind of fig leaf to say, we didn't start this lawfare, you did. And just one final thing just to point out, which is that I was absolutely flabbergasted when Joe Biden, in his last days in office, pardoned not only his son, who, okay, fair enough, was kind of at the center of some very obviously politicized legal trouble, but a whole kind of swathes rest of his family as well. Joe Biden was basically saying, okay, Trump, I accept your premise. The legal system in America is broken to such an extent that I can no longer trust it with the well-being of my family. The legal system is dead. I was amazed that he did that.
So, Connor, just so I can understand what your thinking is on all this, when you hear all this sort of anxious talk of an end of democracy and the threats and the concerns and anxiety, you clearly think the system isn't working. Are you seeking to defend it and find ways to do that, or are you thinking we should move on and you don't hold democracy to be as valuable as maybe other people in the room?
Well, I think lots of, especially young Americans, because they're polling quite in favour of President Trump at the moment, are quite content with democracy compared to lots of my counterparts in the UK or on the European continent, where they're frustrated, and some of them might think that J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference was correct, because they think democracy means one man, one vote, and you respect the outcome of the election, whereas some of the institutions that you listed aren't too keen on that. They will work to resist the candidate that is elected by the people, and the best...
Which one?
Marine Le Pen?
Yes, well, Marine Le Pen or the Romanian election...
Canon Georgescu?
No, and the best example of this I was going to get onto is the Time magazine piece that came out after Joe Biden's election that said the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. And so it was a series of unelected groups, NGOs, Silicon Valley, journalists that coordinated to run an interference campaign against the Trump campaign. And they framed it as saving.
Yeah, but again, I'm sort of, I can hear that you don't like the democratic system. What I'm not hearing is, do you want to defend it or do you want to bury it?
I'm fine with the democratic system.
Right.
I'm just opposed to a stage-managed democratic system. And so the thing that will put people off democracy is if people see the not-so-hidden hand of them being cajoled, right? So if the government invests in a series of NGOs, charities, like USAID or the Charities Act in the UK, that shape public discourse and push it in a particular direction, and that's becoming more and more obvious because of the decentralization of information via social media, so more people are going to become more aware of it, they're going to get disillusioned if they feel that their vote doesn't necessarily matter and that the state's trying to force them to vote a certain way.
Let me ask you, just quickly, Gabriel, with your hat on as somebody who produced a series, which by the way is fantastic, A Coming Storm. I saw we ran many kilometres around Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, fully recommended to our audience there, because it really puts you in the eye of the storm in terms of these conspiracy theories. And considering as this podcast is all about trying to understand how people are controlling the narrative, manipulating people's points of view, are we now in an era where, just picking up from what Connor was saying before, where geographic boundaries don't won't really matter soon. We're effectively in an era of a digital constituency.
Well, I mean, geographic boundaries clearly do matter because our political system is sort of bounded by geographic boundaries.
They do, because as long as people
so long
believe
as-
that there are rules and
so
they
long
want
as
to
the
uphold
nation
them.
state survives, right? There's a whole bunch of people in Silicon Valley who don't believe that the nation states should survive, and a lot of them are big supporters of Donald Trump. One wonders why.
What do you wonder?
Well, one might posit.
With your research?
One might posit that that people from Silicon Valley like a disruptor that is going to shake things up, and maybe shake things up to such an extent that that the whole idea of the nation state becomes obsolete. And you know, I've been to gatherings and I've been to places where people speak openly about this, and they want. It's a movement called the network state movement, where network states will replace nation states. You'd become a citizen of a network state that would have outposts all around the world, sort of franchised statelets. It's almost like imagine you'd be a citizen of your. You choose your citizenship the same way you choose your gym membership, basically.
And your tax jurisdiction, presumably.
And your tax jurisdiction. Right. So this is a very serious movement backed by serious money that is now kind of with access to the White House. I mean, I think to your point, Connor, about people feeling cajoled and manipulated in their democratic vote, I think the biggest problem here, and this is much more of a problem in the United States than it is in Britain, thankfully, is money. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that gets spent in American presidential elections, I looked it up for the last 4 or 5 elections. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's billions and billions.
It's well over $1 billion for the last each.
Well over $1 billion.
And the Wisconsin Supreme Court election just the other day was something like twice as much as the general election bill in 2024 in the UK.
Right. So, and the proportion of that, which is dark money, as in it comes through super PACs where we don't know whether who's providing the money, what interests that, you know, if you're giving $250 million, as Elon Musk did to Donald Trump, you're going to want something in return, or else you're not a very good businessman.
Well, he got fired.
You know,
didn't he? Yeah.
so you know, so they're going to want something in return. When it's dark money and you don't know who they are, therefore you don't know what they want in return. You know, then you do start to feel that actually, you know, this is a threat to you know, Carol Cadwallad's point. This is an oligarchy, not a democracy. By the way, when I checked those figures, it did turn out that the proportion of dark money spent in the last, I think it was 5 or 6 presidential elections, bar the very last one, the Democrats outdid the Republicans in dark money in all of those, apart from the very last.
So I mean, am I right in saying there's a difference between you and that you see the main threat, Connor, coming from centrists, consensus people who are in the middle, who are trying to defend what they think has delivered peace and prosperity for so long, and think it's worth defending, and are scared about what might follow if they don't defend it. Whereas you, Gabriel, are seeing it slightly more coming from the extremes. The threat comes from Silicon Valley. It comes from, is that right? It doesn't come from the centre?
Yes, although I kind of, I empathise with the extremes in a way because, and I don't mean like far right or, you know, but I mean, I empathise with people who feel that the boundaries within which political discourse can happen, the kind of window of possibility, has been sort of quite narrow and constrained.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just going to put to you one argument which would sort of justify that.
Yeah.
And it's the biggest argument we've had since the end of the Second World War. And what drove European integration and the defence of all these institutions was fear of fascism. Mm-hmm. I mean, it happened in the most advanced country in Europe, one of the most advanced countries in Europe. It was inexplicable. It remains pretty inexplicable as to how that could happen in Germany. And I realise the word fascism is thrown around far too often, but it is a legitimate concern of European politicians and societies after the Second World War that we just never go back there. And most, it seems to me, of what we've had since then has had that goal: avoid that happening again. And that's a legitimate goal, and it's been successful.
I totally agree. I mean,
Connor?
I don't know if it's been successful because you've had manifestations of extremism to the contrary. I mean, for example, the UN's Human Rights Charter was, let's say, redrafted by the Soviet Union, who said that we can't have unfettered free speech in case we want to remove Nazi elements in our country, which carved out, in the kind of human rights that we would all agree with here, an exception for the state to censor and suppress dissidents. And they got away with that because, understandably, nobody ever wants to see the Holocaust happen again. But then we didn't police the boundaries of the far left at the very same time. And so I do think that the parameters of acceptable political discourse have been set far too narrow because of this anxiety that if any country breaks away from the rules-based liberal order, these guardrails that we've set up to prevent Nazi Germany from happening again, they'll morph ineluctably into Nazi Germany, when I would contend that it's actually the particular traditions and loyalties of the people to those countries that fought the Nazis that led them to do so rather than allying with them. I think that this rules-based international order that thinks everyone's going to become a Nazi overnight if they break from it is not putting enough faith in its people.
But it's not the only reason that people aligned themselves with those values. It's also because America championed them, and America is the world's largest economy, and America did a lot more trade and will do a lot more to support you militarily and defend you if, say, for instance, you're a European country, if you do align yourself with the world's biggest economy. But America is a different place now. So I want to ask you, how do you view the situation in America in tandem with your own worldview? Let's talk about what you believe. I believe you, as I said before in my introduction, call yourself a revolutionary Catholic Zoomer, is that right?
In that order. Yeah.
Okay, what exactly does that mean? And I understand you've got some rather strident views on things like immigration, on female participation in the workforce. Why do you think that would offer a better future for young people in countries like ours?
Well, my view of female participation in the workforce is that currently, and I think you might agree with me on this, is that liberal capitalism cannibalizes far too much of your private life. So when young women report in surveys, I think it's 92% of them by the new social covenant in late 2023, that they want to have a family, but they feel that they can't afford it because the housing's too expensive and their job takes up too much time.
Why is that only their problem, though?
When did I say it was their problem?
But it's not. But you're saying a survey said that women say but it's not only a woman's problem if a couple can't afford it.
No, but I'm saying they want it. So the problem is with the way that the economy is set up. If they can't afford it and they can't take the time off work to do so, we should absolutely facilitate their ability to have the families they say they want. In terms of views on migration, yes, because
stronger paternity leave legislation would sort that out. Would you agree?
I'm not necessarily sure.
Why not?
Because dependent care obligations in the early years of motherhood usually fall on the mother.
Usually.
Because of the economic side.
Well, no, because it's not just because of the economic side. I mean, okay, I can't breastfeed. That's kind of important.
No, but I can.
Lots of women can't.
Yeah, no, I know, no, but that's what I'm saying.
Lots of women can't and don't as well. They still have children.
But the majority can and do. An exception doesn't disprove a rule. That's what I'm saying. And if women are saying they want families, but it's not flexible enough, then we should make it more flexible, right?
Indeed, by allowing their partners to take more paid time off work.
But there's been quite a few surveys that say that it's a rough split. There's a third of women that would like to work flexibly, a third of women that would like to go back to work full time, and a third of women that would like to take time off work entirely to raise their own kids.
What are the figures for men?
The survey didn't measure that, but I would imagine it's a lot. I would imagine it's a lot lower.
Sorry,
I'd
I think we've gone down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
Let me cite some statistics that I was looking up earlier on today, and these are the government statistics that they published on International Women's Day, which was just the other day, and it was essentially that if they could coax 5% more women back into the UK workforce every single year, this country would be £125 billion richer
Is
in
that
the
good
future.
for children, though?
What do you think?
No.
All right, why?
Because a child's best quality of care is when their mother and their father are close to them. So if you...
What makes you feel But,
It's not feeling. It's Erica Commissar's done some fantastic work on this, by the way. Blood cortisol for a baby, when you take them away from their mother, because obviously they're most used to their mother's heartbeat, their mother's voice, and the like, it spikes and it remains quite high throughout adolescence. So if we, just one example, if we want what's best for the child, then keep them with their biological birth parent. And if the mum wants to stay at home, I don't see why the government should again be cajoling them to get back to the workforce, because we should be doing what's best for families rather than, in your framing, what's best for the GDP. Like, I don't think we should sacrifice people's, let's say, quality of life and their preferred choices just for the sake of growing the economy in an abstract fashion.
Okay, so what we're going to do is throw this out to the audience in a moment. Just before we do, I want to...
Can I point out, I've done some excellent work on this. I've got 2 kids.
I want to start soon, trust me.
we'll so have your questions ready. But just before we do that,
She'll thank you for it.
I'm hearing a lot about the crisis in democracy. I'm not quite hearing where you hope it will go. So I'm talking here about your vision of the best outcome. No one knows what's going to happen. But when you look ahead and you foresee the future, we all understand there's a crisis in liberal democracy now. Why don't I start with you, Connor, and then you, Gabriel. What are you hoping the best outcome of this crisis would be?
Let's say I'm agnostic to the emergent system, but of course nobody hopes for tyranny. I would hope that free speech prevails, and it looks like the US State Department are at least interested in securing that. I would hope that prosperity continues, but I would prefer if GDP per capita were the leading measure rather than GDP, so that people my age can actually get a house and start said families. And I would hope there's a lot less transience and a bit more cultural permanence, because I think a lot of what's driving people my age towards, let's say, extremist political views on both sides of the aisle are an attempt to search for belonging where the traditional avenues of doing so have been broken up. Like 46% of children aged 0 to 14 in this country hit that age and aren't living with their dad, for example. Like, that's just one example of how, like, family breakup, decline of community, decline of religion, and that is depriving people of belonging in their lives, and so they're going to seek extremist political narratives online.
Okay, free speech, wealth, and a sense of community. It doesn't sound terribly controversial.
I mean, I come at this from the point of view of sort of an observer, and I'm not a polemicist. I'm not a campaigner. I don't have a ready-made vision of a kind of post-liberal democratic crisis that we might live in. Again, to go back to the sort of 15th century feudal peasant, he couldn't have imagined all the stuff that we have now, right? Or even the stuff that they had in the 18th century, right? It's just like impossible to imagine. The cities, the thinkers, the technology. What I would say is that I don't think that if you think that this change is happening, which I do, and you look at to go back to Naomi Alderman's framing of it, of information crises, the first information crisis being the invention of writing and the movement to settled agricultural societies from nomadic societies took place over a long period of time, thousands of years. Then the printing press and the kind of modern world took place, the Reformation, all that, it took place over hundreds of years. I think now we're going to be in the space of decades, and I'm not qualified to predict to you what our institutions will look like a few decades hence, but I don't think they'll look exactly like the ones we've got now.
You're doing what I'd have done in this situation,
right,
which is
yes,
artfully dodge the question.
Well, we are in a club of journalists, and impartiality is such, right? And just a quick reminder for our listeners on this podcast, and also for the 100 or so people who have kindly turned up to this event, you're listening to a special edition of Ctrl Alt Deceit, the podcast with myself, Nina Dos Santos, and Owen Bennett-Jones. We're going to be starting to circulate microphones to open up the floor for questions. We still have questions for the two of you, but thank you very much for that animated debate thus far.
I could just add to what I think, what I would not like it to look like, for example, is Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China, right? So I do think, it may sound like I'm sort of saying, it's all shit and we should just let it go, but I'm not. I do think there are things of immense value to be treasured and cherished in in our systems. There are also great problems, I think.
Orban's Hungary. Just quickly, I might as well ask you on that while we're getting the microphones to people. Please put your hand up, and then one will come. Oh, fantastic! That's what we love to see. Not just a full room and a sold-out episode, but some microphones. Just quickly, while we're waiting for the person to ask a question. Hungary, your thoughts? Model for democracy, dystopian future?
Neither. I think Orban's called it an illiberal democracy, hasn't he? I think he has a much more effective style of governance, even if you don't like what he's implementing, with the centralisation of power in the Prime Minister's office rather than outsourcing it to various, let's say, ostensibly neutral bodies. I think the experiment on family planning and birth rates still has to be proven.
Well, women don't pay income tax if they have children, right?
Yeah, you get, and also you get a substantial loan, and for each child you get 25% of the loan knocked off. The birth rate's only ticked up by, I think, 0.2%, but encouraging signs are that the divorce rate has halved and marriage has doubled, and that's the only country that did that during the COVID lockdowns when people weren't having relationships. So that's good, I think.
Interesting. Thanks very much for
Okay,
this.
so what we're going to do here is, I think if Nina agrees, we'll do a male-female order to this. And I can, first of all, we're at the back.
Consulting.
Yeah.
We do a podcast together.
Yes, please. And can you let us know who you are? Yeah.
My name's Paul Birch. That's it, really.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. This is a question for everybody on the panel, really, up on the stage. Is it the fact that you genuinely think democracy is in danger, or that technocracy is in danger? Because what you've seen with the Brexit vote, the rise of reform, and the rise of Trump in the US, is actually a pure form of democracy. At the heart of these Western nations is the vote, the public vote, reasonably regularly in elections. And what it seems to me, and I don't know if the panel agrees, is what's happened in the last decade or so is that you, as in the elite, whatever you want to call them, are just getting results you don't like, and then you're in a bit of a panic. And you can still see it now. The disillusionment with Quangos is, you can see that. You can get that in the public mood, the disillusionment with unelected bodies, the judiciary going against Parliament. You saw it with the proroguing of Parliament, or the attempted proroguing of Parliament. So do you think it's genuinely that democracy is in danger, or just this sort of cosy little arrangement you've had for so long is in danger?
I like this guy.
I mean, I can answer that, but I don't think I should. Why don't you answer, Gabriel?
I think that is a partially fair critique of what we've seen in Europe and elsewhere. We've seen, for example, in, I think it was the Netherlands, wasn't it, a referendum on the EU, and then they gave the wrong answer, so they just held it again, which was obviously ridiculous. So I think that I think that's a partially valid critique. I would also say that we don't live under a kind of direct democracy. We live under a representative democracy, and we do also need people who know what they're doing.
Do we have people who know what they're doing?
Well,
serious question.
That presumes there's a correct school of thought, and that if a vote happens and it is objected to according to that school of thought, it can be denied.
No, that's not assuming that. But when I say we need people who know what they're doing, I mean that there doesn't have to be one correct answer to know what they're doing, but we need experts, for want of a better word. Experts can disagree, but we need people who are experts in their field who make things work in a complex society.
Like vaccine science, maybe, yeah. I mean, it's well established, it's been there for 150 years, it works. So that's the, we need people who understand that, so running the system.
During the Cultural Revolution in China, I think they didn't like experts, and they got rid of doctors because they were experts, and it didn't have, it had a poor outcome on the nation's health. We don't want that, right? So everything is, I think there's very much a tendency to see things in extremes, black and white, and things aren't as simple as that. And yes, there is a valid critique to be made of quangos and unelected bodies that may have greater power than one would wish in a democratic system, and you would wish that somehow a democratic voice could override them. But we don't want to do away with everyone who knows what they're doing.
I want another question from the audience, but quickly, can I ask you, Connor, what do you think about anti-vax movements? How do you feel about vaccine science, for instance, and the fact that, say, during the COVID pandemic, people just had to have it, otherwise they couldn't go back to work? Was that badly construed?
I think that was
anti-democratic?
Yes, and also I think if you wanted to increase trust in the experts, you should have allowed people to make up the mind for themselves rather than restricted their ability to go to work for taking it. And also medical experts should not have misrepresented things. For example, Anthony Fauci, behind the scenes, sending emails saying that the likes of Jay Bhattacharya and the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration should be counter-signalled at the executive level, or saying that, well, masks don't work and you shouldn't wear them, and then coming out and admitting, well, we only said that because we wanted time to stockpile all the PPE and so other people didn't take it for ourselves. You should have been transparent with the public at every stage of this, and they might have had more trust in said experts.
All right, let's take another question from the audience. Who has the microphone? The lady there. Just a quick reminder for everybody in the audience, we've got lots of you asking questions. Just keep your questions tight if you can, because also this will be on the recording. Thanks.
My name is Maitri, and you know what? We're at the Frontline Club, so as journalists, why don't we take some responsibility for some of the issues that we're seeing in the world, in the lack of trust in experts, as we can hear from the room. I'm curious, Connor, as to what you said. You were 26. You haven't been out into the world that long. So
that's awfully presumptive.
It's 26, right? I mean, in 26 years, I'm very curious as to the 3 or 4 issues that have really driven the way you think, because that is something I think we as journalists and we as perhaps adults don't understand. Why do you think the way you do? The 3 or 4 issues that happened that have actually formulated your position.
And those are immigration, family?
Yeah, immigration, lockdown and climate change, I think. Immigration because I went to school in the most diverse cohort in British history, and I can see how people's cultural background and their family background influences their likelihood of buying into the Western story or the British story or liberal democracy. So I went to school with a bunch of really nice Nigerian kids, for example. Interpersonally, they're all very nice. But then the Nigerian kids would have disputes with the Ghanaian kids. And then the African kids would have disputes with Caribbean kids. And the black kids would have disputes with the white kids. And so there's a kind of factionalism that builds up. And you just notice it on the lunch tables. And so this might affect politics as we go along. As we mentioned civil war earlier, for example, right? David Betts, who works at King's College London, has been doing the rounds in interviews recently. And he said the kind of catalyst he's most worried about for civil conflict is increased ethnic and cultural stratification, and then a kind of identity grievance politics that pits people against one another, which is, it was the narrative that came out of the death of George Floyd, for example, the critiques of white racism and white supremacy. And if you drill that into the heads of people who are second generation from other countries, and you tell them that actually you can't be friends with this person because there's a secret hatred of them at all times, that's going to increase antagonisms.
I'll just say to this, I live in a Welsh village.
Yes.
Where there are antagonisms between the Welsh and the Anglos.
Yep.
And it's been going on since 1282.
Yes. That means so we shouldn't.
It's fine.
No, it's not fine.
Yeah.
It's not. No, it's not. How is it?
The Welsh might disagree.
No, pause. They can throw buns at it. I'm a deracinated Welshman.
Hang on. That's fine for you to say it's not a problem from your Welsh village. That is an intranational conversation. That doesn't mean we need to.
Not really. I don't think the Welsh would say it like that.
The United Kingdom, the British Isles.
They don't believe in it.
Okay. It's a landmass that we're locked in, whether we like it or not, right? Okay. Does that mean we import? Does that mean we import ethnic and religious prejudices from other parts of the world? For example, the recent reignition of the conversation around Pakistani Muslim rape gangs in the UK, right? That is a completely preventable problem. It is.
I think you're getting away from my point.
No, I'm not getting away from
it. No. You've realised for a moment there
that you've picked an example that is landlocked to the UK. So we're stuck with that, right? I agree, we're stuck with it. I don't think the Welsh and the English are going to take up arms against each other anytime soon, thankfully, you know, because I wouldn't want to see Wales crushed. But that does not mean, it does not mean that because we have a localised conflict, we import other conflicts from around the world when we know they can happen. So that is part of the immigration issue. The final issue is the climate change one. We've spent a hell of a lot of money on, or I say we, the government has spent a hell of a lot of money on unproductive remedies to climate change issues. I helped write a paper that said, here's how you can fund nuclear power without relying on the Chinese investment, because we let them buy up our nuclear power plants because the government funds it. You can instead put the burden on the energy companies that are actually going to make the money from it. Did they listen? No, of course they didn't.
I have all sorts of follow-up questions, but we've got loads of questions in the audience.
It's that. Yeah. You've been asking since the beginning, so go for it.
Hey, my name's Theo A. Mullis. I'm ex-cop, now a freelancer. I write a Substack, Dictators v. Democrats. What I think we may have missed tonight is AI and other emergent technologies. They threaten to shred the job market as we know it at the moment. The majority of this tech is held by corporations which are not necessarily democratic. How can we democratize these technologies?
Gabriel?
Well, it's not that they're not necessarily democratic. They're not democratic, obviously. They're just you know, profit-making machines, and that is their ultimate aim. And if you look at the sort of the paperclip thought experiment, you will find that, you know, the ultimate kind of expression of this is that the world gets gobbled up by corporations whose only purpose is to make more money and not to do anything else. And so I think that is a very big problem. How can we, what was the question? How can we stop them from, democratize?
Especially in the age of AI, because it's going to cannibalize our jobs, basically.
Yeah,
right?
well, it's going to cannibalize our jobs. So who's going to be making the money out of all these jobs that are going to be done by the machines? It's not going to be you and me, right? So it's going to be those companies. So, I mean, I can think of a way of doing it.
Tax them.
Tax the shit out of them and give them, and have a universal basic income.
But the government's just rolled that back.
But anyway,
So-
that'll be one way to do it.
Do you think that will actually happen?
I don't know.
Let's take a question from this lady first.
Should we just wait for the microphone, if that's all right? There we go. Here it comes.
My name's Charlotte Eager, and I was a foreign correspondent for some years, and I now have a podcast called Why Am I in Your Country? And we run something, my husband and I call the Trojan Women Project, where we work with refugees and asylum seekers. I'm actually following up on the question we've just had. So, having seen the collapse of socialism and understanding that it failed because it didn't really failed basically because it didn't understand that human beings were greedy, and would only do things in their own interest. Capitalism, which lovely idea that it is, again, I think it's got to the stage where it's failing because human beings are greedy. So we've entered global capitalism, liberal capitalism has ended up in a situation where these very few people at the very top of society are making enormous amounts of money, where the rest of us are getting poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer. So do you think that it is the responsibility of democracy to put controls in place so that liberal capitalism can't actually go out of control, because untrammeled capitalism is bad for people?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. That's what we're seeing in Silicon Valley, isn't it?
So, yes, with a couple more sentences, and then Connor.
I'll just go for yes.
Yes, with a couple of caveats, because I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool materialist. I think that it's sensible to focus on energy security and your industrial base first, because that will actually allow wealth to trickle down, rather than just focusing on digital services and the like. And a quick point on the AI thing, I think we should be worried less about the economy than we should about governance, because of all those stats that my generation are interested in outsourcing things to a strongman or an expert, well, if they can't agree over which person should occupy the government instead, then they could outsource it to a neutral AI.
But they're already doing that.
Yeah, I know, but like properly.
But they are properly doing it.
And then they might be incorporating AI into like gov.uk, but they might just say, well, let's let the AI actually govern.
No, this is happening.
Not even have a
This is happening.
Tell us how it's
This is
happening.
happening. So I read a study which was actually from 2020, which is like the Paleosauric age in terms of is that even a thing? In terms of AI. Whereby it said that 50% of all US government departments had incorporated some elements of automated decision-making, AI-generated automated decision-making, and even they didn't know what these decisions were being based on and how they were being made. And this is from 2020. This stuff is is happening, and so the ultimate kind of, I can see Mr. Sweeney at the back there. The ultimate. The ultimate, if you sort of extrapolate this to its kind of ultimate conclusion, democracy is kind of dead anyway, because we're going to get replaced by a machine, because the machine is faster and smarter, but and you neutral. Can't control it.
And
but
in
it's
the
not
future
neutral.
warfare,
no one says it's neutral.
And in the future warfare, gentlemen, they could decide whether or not to kill us, right?
Yeah.
With drones. Your
but
thoughts on that?
Just to finish this off, Helen Toner, the woman who resigned from the board of OpenAI, whenever that was, in 2023, over whether or not Sam Altman was being open with the board about whether he was creating super intelligent AI that was going to kill us all. This woman resigned from the board, and her view, this is a woman who understands this, she lives and breathes AI, her view is that the real danger from AI at the moment is that we end up living in what she called the Wall-E kind of world, where we just kind of trundle around in our kind of moving chairs, eating shit food, and not having any control over anything that is meaningful in our lives. And I think this is a real danger.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, there's so many questions, and I have got prior permission from Nina to do this. Could we take a whole lot of questions, because the issues you're raising are interesting, and can you note down perhaps, if you've got pen and paper, on what's coming up? So first of all here, and then we'll go through a few questions. Yes, go for
myself,
it.
not you.
Hi, I'm Pranav. I'm based in Paris. I'm a documentary filmmaker. Sometimes I during this conversation, I think a lot of us, it sounds like a lot of us in this room seem to disagree with some of the things that Connor's saying. But occasionally I feel that there are kernels of truth in bits and pieces of what he's saying, and I think
that's the highest possible compliment.
The rest you're going to get, that's the rest.
And the point that the lady made at the front about neoliberal capitalism, I think sometimes the critiques, I don't necessarily agree with the solutions, but some of the critiques seem to be shared on both sides of the divide, as it were. I just wanted to ask the panel about a kind of radical empathy on listening to people from the other side, and whether both people from both sides would be prepared to do that, because ultimately I think that's the only way we're going to move forward, whether you profoundly disagree with the other person or not.
It's a really, really interesting thought, and it's increasingly difficult, apparently. There's a question here. No, can we go here, because this hand's been up for right from the beginning.
Hi, my name is Cecilia Holter. I'm a writer. I am puzzled that none of you have explored the external threats to our democracies, that we are being eroded from within, but it started from outside. Alexander Dugin, we're talking about paid, financed parties that are destroying us, our own parties, the FAD syndrome, the Le Pen. To me, this is a far greater danger. And we're talking about ultra-leftist academia on one hand, spewing Marxist colonial guilt, and then you have the far right spewing their own cynicism, and we end up with people, with children who do not believe in objective truth anymore, which is exactly what they wanted to achieve. I'm very concerned.
No, let's go here, because you've had your hand up. Yep, right, so just behind. That's it.
Hello, my name is Anthony Thomas. I'm a retired documentary filmmaker. I'd just like to thank the panel for this wonderful discussion. But when our theme is the threat to liberal democracy, I'm surprised that no one has mentioned religion in this conversation. I'll put Islam completely to one side and concentrate on Christianity. Whether we're talking about the Russian Orthodox Church and its support for Putin's form of nationalism, or whether we're talking about the millions of fundamentalist Christians in the United States who have made Trump possible. And that's something I've really studied closely. And if you have a large group of people who believe that the world was literally created 5,000 years ago in 6 days, the next step, and I'm talking about real belief here, the next step is all the information you receive from experts, from so-called medical experts, all lies, all part of a conspiracy. And I think that large group of people, whom I know very well, have done so much damage to American democracy. And I feel we should consider that in our theme tonight.
Okay, so you'd like to take those three, Nina?
Let's just pause for a second
Yeah.
and let's bounce off the last question from you, sir. Thank you very much for that, because obviously, Connor, you are quite motivated by your Catholic faith, aren't you?
I'm a bit rubbish at it, but I'd like to think so. I think that they came to some very solid conclusions a few thousand years before we did. So there must be something there. Mainly the principle of Imago Dei, that we all have the spark of inalienable human dignity in us, and that's the foundation for Blackstone's formulation. It's the foundation for common law. It's the foundation for human rights law. And I think actually I would like to invert that question a little bit, if I may, because I'm not a Branch Davidian or a Mormon or any of the other slightly strange denominations. I would say that if you strip the underlying moral substrate out from a constitution, then the words mean little to the people that have inherited it. And this is why you're seeing a lot of squabbling over the rule of law, whether or not the Constitution means anything, because laws and systems of government are resting on priors that without the religious foundations of the United States, they can't necessarily guarantee. So as much as we would like to afford protections to all sorts of people, all sorts of cultures, all sorts of religions, you do need to have a dominant culture, and it needs to be the origin one of the government in order to sustain it. And so I think the fall of Christianity has actually been a very bad thing.
Okay, so just taking those questions that we had, we'll do another round of three in a moment. As for radical empathy, I hope we're doing it a bit, and trying to listen to everyone in the room. I would just say, Gabriel, before we began this, we were just talking briefly about the external threats and the internal threats, and I think you thought I was focusing too much on the external threats from Russia and China.
Not you in particular.
No, but I mean, as we were discussing
people,
it, and you're saying that's missing the point. The problem is internal.
I think it is missing the point. I'm sorry to disagree with you, or I'm not sorry to disagree with you. I myself has spent, as Christopher Steele can attest, some time looking into Russia's kind of malign business of trying to influence both American politics, French politics, German politics. I've done a lot of reporting on this. And while I acknowledge that those efforts are there, I think they are small compared to the internal factors that have brought about this crisis of faith in the current system, the factors that have brought Trump to power. If you look at the amount of money that I did a whole panorama investigation into the amount of money the then still Front National had received from Russia, it wasn't a lot of money, right? It was money, and it was wrong that they got it and tried to hide it, but it wasn't a lot of money, right? The Russia stuff with Trump and 2016, and I think maybe Christopher Steele and I might still differ on this, but I think the fact remains that Donald Trump was not a Russian agent. Yes, the Russians had a troll farm and blah blah blah, but he won the election in 2016 fair and square. That's and that's not on the Russians. It's on the Americans. Again, Germany. I looked at a case where Russia was financing an AfD local candidate who did end up in the Bundestag, and who boasted to his Russian friends that he could be his Russian handlers boasted to their superiors in the Kremlin. I found a document that said we'll have a totally controlled MP in the Bundestag. Yay. Okay, well done, guys. But still, the AfD is a much bigger force. So I agree that it's there, but it's not the main thing. And by focusing on it, you neglect to look in the mirror.
And there's similar examples in the European Parliament as well, aren't they? Thank you very much for those questions. Let's take another three.
Radical empathy. Yes.
All for radical empathy, particularly in the bar downstairs afterwards. Let's take three more questions. So the lady there with the fringe, just wait for the microphone first. Oh, we'll take. Thank you. Great.
Hi. So my name's Lois Boyle. I'm 19. I'm currently a student at the University of Glasgow. I had a question for Connor about, I believe you said earlier that it was the majority of people in our generation, I guess, said that they would not fight to, I guess, support the UK if it was under attack. I don't know if that was the exact wording, and that you were surprised by that and you would defend the UK in that sense, or not?
No,
well, a clarification, would you say that you would enlist to defend the UK? Was that correct?
No.
No. Okay, what was your kind of stance on that then?
I am unsurprised that among this generation, 89% would not want to do so because our recent foreign policy ventures haven't been the most successful nor the most justified, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. The government from all angles seems to be upsetting pretty much every demographic. Like, young men like me thinks that, being discouraged to join the RAF, for example, because they call us useless white male pilots, is not the best recruiting strategy, whereas a large share of the same survey respondents also said that Britain is an institutionally racist country and always has been. So, if you...
Let's not conflate those issues.
No, I'm saying they're two separate.
Sorry, my question more was that instead of foreign policy, looking inwards at the UK, I guess, is it not surprising to you that a lot of people our age would not want to support the current UK liberal democracy because liberal democracy could be argued to be dead in the UK? I mean, we have seen our age that we have had 2 unelected prime ministers of the same party when political tides were turning against the Conservatives. Not a lot has been done for young people of our age. We still pay tuition fees, we still pay... especially with my A-levels, our GCSEs, our grades were decided based on where we lived.
Yep.
Looking internally, would you maybe say that that is more the reason that people would not want to defend the UK because there hasn't really been a liberal democracy that people our age have seen?
Yeah, sorry, are we picking other questions first?
Just finish off with that and then we'll get another question from
that. The education system was utterly destroyed by Michael Gove. The Conservatives mismanaged the economy for about 14 years, coming off the back of Blair and Brown, who also did a pretty bad job as well. There were the tumult over the Brexit vote, no matter which way you voted. I mean, it being held up didn't look like democracy in action. And I think lockdowns themselves did far more damage to liberal democracy than any outside interference, even though it does exist, could ever. Because if the government can declare democracy no longer exists with a press conference and it lasts 2 years and it makes up a disproportionate amount of your and my lifetime, no wonder they don't believe that their vote will do anything.
Now, I'm conscious there's only 15 minutes left. Somebody who was on our tape there, who's a big voice for liberal democracy, is John Sweeney over there, I can see on the left.
I'm John Sweeney, I'm a Liberal Democrat, very bad Catholic.
You and me both.
And a Liberal Democrat candidate in the last election, right?
Connor,
yes.
Can you explain your theory of free speech to the late Alexei Navalny?
Pardon?
Can you explain your theory of free speech to the late Alexei Navalny?
As in, because he was murdered by Putin, well, murdered, obviously, in prison.
Okay, as in, why didn't J.D. Vance, who you referenced, why didn't he address that? Why didn't he address the fact that you could say everything you've said here tonight at the Valdai conference in Russia, and people like Alexei Navalny get murdered? And can you reflect on the difference between British society and British free speech and what happens to people who dare to speak in Russia?
I can reflect on those two things. First of all, I would assume that Vance is using, and the Trump administration are using it as a strategic bargaining chip to stay stum to try and get Putin to the negotiating table. We're going to... Sorry. I'm not disagreeing that he's going to absolutely take advantage. I'm just trying to get in their mentality.
Wondering if they have a bargaining strategy with...
That's my assumption. Yeah. As far as free speech in Russia, yeah, it doesn't exist. But also the problem here is that we also have stringent speech laws that were applied where they shouldn't have. I mean, on
but we don't be in jail for being
on raw
here
numbers, more people.
If we're in Russia,
hang on,
even the audience.
Hang on. On raw numbers, more people are jailed for speech violations in the UK than they are in Russia. They are.
That's partly because people don't open
No.
their mouths.
That's just on the raw numbers. Now.
Or the cost is death.
No.
Wait. We've got to get into this. Which numbers are you using?
What about people who've been murdered?
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I don't. How is it an idiotic response?
Okay, let's just get the microphone to John so you can.
Sorry, but what about the people who've been murdered?
Those things are bad. Of course, the Russians murdering their political opposition are terrible.
How many people have been murdered in Britain?
Peter Lynch.
Sorry?
Peter Lynch. Do you know that name? Peter Lynch. Does it mean anything?
No.
Okay. Peter Lynch was a 61-year-old granddad who stood outside one of the riots last summer, where people were, of course, engaging in all sorts of horrible behaviour, like trying to set light to an asylum hotel. Peter Lynch did none of that. He shouted that the police called them traitors and held up a sign about the World Economic Forum. One of the conspiracy theorists you think is pretty wrong. He was sent to prison for 2 years, I believe it was. Had a heart condition and hung himself in jail because he was afraid of being attacked.
That's not murder.
No, because he was afraid of being attacked by fellow inmates who Keir Starmer had labelled them all as far-right racists. So he was put in the conditions that led him to take his own life. I think that is wrong. I also, of course, think that Russia is awful and I would not want to bloody live there.
Okay, so politically, though, what I'm talking about, for example, people I've met,
yes,
and we're critical of Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
Anna, I'm so angry, I forgot.
Do you understand that I don't like Vladimir Putin? Do you understand that?
No, but I don't understand, that you're applying your mind to the following. Anna Politivskaya and Natasha Esmerova, two great journalists, critical of Putin, in particular his war in Chechnya. Thirdly, Boris Nemtsov, and then Alexei Navalny.
Yeah.
In order, poisoned then shot,
yes.
shot, poisoned, and poisoned again,
yes.
Dead.
All terrible.
So these are people who challenge Putin's political power,
yes.
not like the pensioner you're talking about.
Yes.
These are people who've all been murdered. There are many, many more of them. And it seems to be absurd that you are highlighting weaknesses and bad spots in our record while completely ignoring the serial killing by the killer in the Kremlin.
Because the title is Democracy in Danger, and Russia isn't a democracy. So the point being, how am I?
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to fix any of that. I'm pointing out that if you want to preserve a democracy in the UK, these are the inherent flaws in it, and we need to address them. Just because Putin is a nutcase tyrant who murders journalists does not mean that it is also unjust for the UK government to imprison people.
So I'm going to ask a question to Gabriel, which will perhaps sort of reveal some of these items. We heard from someone saying the younger generation hadn't got housing, they had to pay university fees and so on, and that there's this limits to free speech in the UK. I mean, to me, as someone who's travelled the world and reported on it, these problems in the UK are so infinitesimal compared to those in Russia, Pakistan, Africa, around the world.
Doesn't mean a lot of that, though.
Well, it does mean that we need some perspective, I think, and that, and I agree, we need 1.5 million houses, like the government says. We probably need 3 million houses. I mean, and these planning rules are crazy, and there are reforms to be made, but the problems just seem so petty.
Yeah,
compared to those.
I hear what you're saying. I do hear what you're saying. I do think, though, that none of the places that you mentioned are liberal democracies.
Yeah.
And the topic of this conversation is what's going wrong with liberal democracy. And I think the fact that we're much better off here than we are in China or Russia or Pakistan or Turkey, or in terms of our freedom of speech and our ability to say things and not ever end up in jail, your pensioner example notwithstanding, and there are, there have been a sort of a steady drip of examples of people who've been sent to jail in this country for stuff that I think most of us would agree they shouldn't have been, whether it be being annoying and sitting down in the middle of a motorway or a thoroughfare, and et cetera, right? So let's, I just think that we should not neglect to make our own polity better because there's terrible stuff going on elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay, let's take 3 more. I've been given permission to select them. You have been asking a long time, so can we go to the one at the front here, and then I'll see you there at the back. Yeah. Yes.
Hi there, Willie Sterling from Why Am I in Your Country podcast. Could I ask all of you to define actually what you mean by the word liberal in the context of the fact that up until 111 years ago, liberalism, liberal politicians, liberal values, global free trade supported the greatest empire the world had ever known, which not only ran the bits coloured red on the map, but all the rest of the world. on the bill on London? What does the word liberal mean now?
I did have a go at that at the beginning, but obviously not satisfactorily. You could have another question at the back.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Milka Avdic. I come from Bosnia. I've been here for more than 30 years. I'm an activist and a writer. Before I get to my question, if I can just make one quick comment that I'm surprised by the lack of the word education used tonight, because democracy is not intuitive, especially in this day of information flooding. I'm a writer, and I'm currently working on a book, and my research led me to believe that we actually have more power as consumers today than as voters. Would you agree with that? And how much would it change the way we are supposed to view our reality and try and get back the government that's supposed to do the government's job rather than, Margaret Thatcher version of the government?
Okay, and one more here. Just you, sir. Yep. And I will take yours as well, because we'll do 4. Yes.
Hi there. My name's Sam Peters. I'm a journalist at CNN. What makes you most concerned about the future of our democracy, but also, to maybe end on a more positive note, what makes you optimistic?
Okay, and one more here, if we could just get this one here. Yep, in the second row. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is to Connor. Is there another country in the world, Connor, in which you would prefer to live? And if so, why don't you move there?
Well,
Okay, so let's well, I should let you respond to that, Connor, first of all, and then we'll get to the other questions.
Because one of my chiefest complaints is that the cultural and population churn has changed.
Answer the question.
I am. There's no need to be rude. No. I am. No. Hang on. I'm saying the reason I'm saying no. The reason.
Name a country.
No. You have to let him respond to. We're talking radical empathy.
Yeah. Thank you. The reason I'm saying no is because even though I don't think things are being run very well in this country at the moment, I would miss my family. I would miss the roads that I know.
Sir, may I ask you, if this was a gentleman of Pakistani origin who was complaining about some of the
institutional
institutional racism, would you be saying to him, sir, if you don't like it, you can bugger off elsewhere?
My question is because
No, you wouldn't.
No, answer the question, sir.
I wish to be proud of it, and you've spent the whole evening rubbishing it. And so it seems a perfectly fair question: is there some other country of the world?
So people
think is preferable?
People who have criticism to this country, even if they were born here and they love the area, they love their family and that here, if they have criticisms of the way it's run, they should just up sticks and leave. Is that?
No, of course the criticisms are you spent the whole evening rubbishing the country. So I'm rather surprised you want to live here.
Okay. We've dealt with that. Thank you for that exchange. And
the next one was about education.
Yes, education. Well, I mean, the Trump administration wants to abolish the Department for Education, and actually, this may have seemed to come out of the blue. But if you've been kind of hanging around in the weirder end of the MAGA swamps for as long as I have, this has actually been a very big movement. That was sort of supercharged by COVID, and it's a combination of ideological reasons and financial reasons. So there are people who believe that the education system is a sort of system of indoctrination, a kind of communist, quote unquote, system of indoctrination. As somebody who comes from a country that was once communist, you probably wouldn't recognize that definition of communism, but that people say is currently on the rise in America, but let's put that to one side. But then, of course, there are all these private education providers that got a huge boost during COVID, and they would very much like to keep that boost. So if we can just defund all the public schools and give it to the private companies instead, well, that would be nice for some people's pockets. Follow the money.
Now, speaking of private companies, I want to pick up on that question that we had about whether or not people have no say as consumers. And we've seen that play out with Elon Musk, haven't we? Because his Doge initiative has backfired enormously because Tesla's share price has created and sales have falling through the floor.
I think
do you agree?
I think that might partially be to do with a lot of the attacks that are being broadcast on the news as well. So people are discouraged from buying one if they think it's going to be lit on fire if they have one in Seattle.
I mean, I've seen them around here and
in America. I'm saying in America
over here with big stickers saying we do not support Elon Musk,
of course,
do not attack my car.
Yeah.
I actually have.
I think the issue might be with the attacking the cars
Was
there,
apart
and less
from
Elon
where
Musk.
you lived, I think.
But it was interesting. It was you as well, wasn't it, who made the point about consumers have more power than voters.
I agree.
Which, if you accept that premise, I'm not sure that I agree. I don't know whether I agree with it or not. But it's a valid question to ask. But if you accept it, then you accept that capitalism has cannibalized democracy.
Yeah, that's probably
Do you think it has?
Well, no, I said I don't know, but
Right.
if you know.
Right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this edition of
We never
Control
defined
Alt
liberalism.
Deceit.
so-
I'm happy to.
Well, he did it at the beginning.
It's meant so many different things over the years. Define what it means now.
Oh, optimism. Yes, sorry, optimism. Yeah, because we always have this. I do have something to say about this, which is that, and I'm going to go back to my 15th century peasant. I'm very sorry about that. But the 15th century peasant who was wringing his hands about the death of the feudal order and where are all our certainties going to come from, could not have dreamt of the human rights and the enfranchisement and the prosperity and all the thoughts and the philosophers and the art and all the wonderful stuff that emerged from the collapse of that old order. And amid all the turbulence that we undoubtedly will experience and are already experiencing, we will also, and our children and our children's children, will also, hopefully, if we don't burn ourselves to a frazzle in the meantime, experience some amazing things, the likes of which we can't even imagine.
Well, our perspectives are certainly being challenged, and so just to add my point to Owen's, priorities in terms of liberal democracy, I have a different perspective because I was educated in French, and so rather than John Locke, it's the Voltaire School and Rousseau I'm thinking of, but free speech for us journalists is absolutely sacrosanct, especially in an institution like the Frontline Club, and equal rights, free courts, checks and balances, free education, whether it's in French or in English, or in America or in the United Kingdom, is absolutely crucial as well. But time is of the essence, and that's something that we cannot get back, people. And I want to thank you all for coming to this special live recording of Ctrl Alt Deceit here at the Frontline Club in London.
Ctrl Alt Deceit is, I should just say, produced by Piers Lynch and edited by Piers in association with Democratis. So this is Owen Bennett-Jones.
And I'm myriad Santos. And before you press not Ctrl Alt Deceit, but Ctrl Alt Delete, don't turn us off yet. We've only just gotten started with our second series. For those of you who are here to see the screener of our first series, you get an idea of what we're trying to do. We're also dialing into the conversation from both sides of this perspective on these topical issues, and we'll have 8 more series online on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You could also follow us at Ctrl_Danger on X, if you still use that, Blue Sky, and elsewhere. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks so much for staying with us until the end of this episode of Ctrl Alt Deceit. We really hope that you've enjoyed this week's show. And don't forget that every week on a Friday, we'll be releasing new shows and new material as well via our social media channels. You can subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts from, and follow snippets of the show on Twitter, where our X handle is at CTRL_Danger, or X if you call that platform that, and Blue Sky and LinkedIn as well. We also have a YouTube channel too. Please subscribe, and also don't forget to comment on the podcast. That way more people get to hear about it.